Hey everyone, this is Moderate Rebels, and I am Ben Norton. My co-host Max Blumenthal has a new show hosted over at the platform Rockfin, that is Rokfin. His show is called Foreign Agents, and we've been facing a lot of increasing censorship on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. Big tech Silicon Valley corporations are being extremely aggressive in cracking down on alternative voices and independent media. So Max has a new show over at Rockfin, which has no censorship. It's a great new independent platform. There's a lot of cool independent journalists over there. So you can find his show, Foreign Agents. I also have a new show at Rockfin called Propaganda Today. So we're still going to continue bringing you Moderate Rebels regularly. And in this episode today, Max spoke with Marcie Smith Parenti, talking about two different issues. One is the U.S. government-backed regime change guru Gene Sharp, one of the masterminds of the U.S. regime change strategies and soft coups that we've seen targeted many countries. And they also spoke about another issue which you're not allowed to really even mention on YouTube. Otherwise, the algorithm will just go crazy. It'll censor the video and all of that. So if you want to check that out, you can go over to rokfin.com, Rockfin. But this is going to be the discussion that they had about Gene Sharp. And this is also available as a podcast if you want to just listen to it over at Moderate Rebels. So anyway, without further ado, here is Max's discussion with Marcie Smith Parenti on U.S. government-backed regime change guru Gene Sharp.
And welcome to Foreign Agents. I'm here with Marcie Smith Parenti, who has done some incredible work on two issues that I think are essential to talk about today. The first one is that we're going to talk about is Gene Sharp, who's someone who's been widely praised in progressive media as a guru of nonviolence, a kind of theoretician in the vein of Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi, but he's someone who I realized is enormously influential, if not the most influential figure in helping to devise the tactics of NATO-backed or U.S. regime change operations. I want to get started, actually, Marcie, before I bring you in, by playing some a clip of Gene Sharp, this figure who has influenced so many of the people we write about at the Grayzone, and who, when we talk about people we write, we mean U.S. assets in countries like Nicaragua or Venezuela, who are regime change assets, essentially. Let's listen to what Gene Sharp says about his theories here. I think it's very revealing.
People sometimes speak of nonviolence, which is not a word I like. It's too vague, sloppy, etc., etc. Nonviolence, and then there's armed struggle. And of course, everybody knows armed struggle is more effective because you've got something to fight with. And you've got nonviolence, you've got the absence of something. I say nonviolent struggle is armed struggle. And we have to take back that term from those advocates of violence who try to justify with pretty words that kind of combat. Only with this type of struggle, one fights with psychological weapons, social weapons, economic weapons, and political weapons. And that this is ultimately more powerful against oppression, injustice, and tyranny than is violence. This is a technique of combat. It is a substitute for war and other violence. It is not compromise.
So those are some pretty provocative comments from Gene Sharp. He's saying that nonviolence, his tactics, are actually a form of combat. Now, in your essay, I think what you do that a lot of people who praised him on his death several years ago don't do is you point out that those tactics of combat are directed against a very specific target. So here's your piece at Non-Site, and you call it Gene Sharp's neoliberal nonviolence. You write, Gene Sharp, the Machiavelli of nonviolence, has been fairly described as the most influential political figure you've never heard of. He's been praised by Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky, nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize compared to Gandhi. He's been influential in the US activist left, but he's also someone who has links to the CIA and has influenced regime change operations that have been directed by US intelligence and to the benefit of corporations against socialist states. So talk about Gene Sharp. Who is he, and why is he, what do you mean by neoliberal nonviolence?
Yes, and thanks for that introduction, Max. So, I think that you introduced some of the general outlines of who Gene Sharp is pretty well. So he was a social scientist. His focus was on theorizing the mechanics of nonviolent action, which he understood, as you said, to be not sort of a moral system necessarily, but a system of combat. Which is not to say that he didn't have his origins in pacifism. He did, and he had relationships with those in the pacifist movement and in other nonviolent struggles. But this was perhaps one of the most important things about my research, is that it illustrated that really Sharp's perhaps most important and certainly one of his most deliberately sought audiences was the US defense establishment. So for 30 years, he worked at a place called the Center for International Affairs at Harvard, which was a major node of the emerging national security state. Some of, the Cold War's greatest luminaries were there. Robert Bowie, who was future director of the CIA, Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Pardon me, it's hot. You can look up the list. Thomas Schelling, this is all in the piece. But suffice it to say, this Center for International Affairs at Harvard, which was nicknamed the CIA at Harvard, was a major, kind of early think tank that was theorizing, among other things, how the US could prosecute the Cold War and win. And Gene Sharp was very clear that he was anti-communist. He was very clear, although he didn't write about it very much. When he did write about it, he was very clear as to his preferences for economic policy. He thought the government should get out of quote unquote, intervening in markets. Tellingly, he wrote a book called Social Power and Political Freedom, where he really illuminates these ideas more thoroughly than anywhere else. Anyhow, and in this book, he's very clear that, for him, nonviolence is, a method of combat and also a sort of aspiration in society. He wants a nonviolent society, by which he means limited government, because for him and in his conception of violence, centralized government is a key vector, perhaps the key vector of violence.
Right.
Indeed.
Right. Let's hear Gene Sharp again in his own words, talking about his theory of nonviolence and the importance of non-negotiation. How essentially those who are protesting the state should never negotiate because the state uses it in order to reduce their demands. And this is essentially a recipe for regime change.
The bringing down the old system, the old dictatorial system.
And it doesn't seem to you that people there are trading one form of oppression for another?
That often happens. And it's a good step to bring down the old oppression.
He's talking about the Arab Spring.
But it's not sufficient. So they have to be very careful.
Well, it seems the Egyptians weren't very careful. What they have now is their military brutally cracking down on protesters. We hear about all kinds of abuses. Islamists are gaining power in the country. My question is this: what kind of democracy could the current state of affairs in Egypt possibly create?
See, the rebels made a mistake. They should never agreed that Mubarak's condition I'll give the power over to the army and then I'll resign. That was foolish, because that army has just been the agent of repression in Egypt for decades, and they're not going to change overnight. It's unclear what their strategy is. I don't know. I don't have detailed information of what their planning is at all. But that's a different kind of situation than the predominantly nonviolent struggle movement.
Well, it did start out as a largely nonviolent popular uprising, but we see what it turned into. Could it be that your concept of nonviolent uprisings is kind of overdue in this day and age? I mean, look at the Arab world. It's a bloody mess.
You get bloody messes when you get people standing up and saying we want a change.
I mean, we can just stop it there, but that's such a revealing comment. You get bloody messes, and he wants people to just walk into bloody messes and be massacred because of this marginal violence theory that he has. But here you can see in one of his last interviews, he's kind of taking credit for the Arab Spring. Marcie, I want to get you to react to that clip of Gene Sharp and his comments about the Arab Spring, and then talk a little bit about his relationship with Peter Ackerman, who, you know, was involved with Michael Milken, the junk bond salesman, and helped set up Sharp's CIA-backed Albert Einstein Institute. So, you know, if you have any reaction to his comments there about, you know, people just happen to turn into a bloody mess sometimes, and then what the Albert Einstein Institute is and its influence globally.
So I think that one just distinction before we move on, because part of what has thwarted candid public discussions about Gene Sharp, he's been referred to as the most important political figure you've never heard of, is because previous critics have overstated the case. So, for example, I didn't find, for example, that the Albert Einstein Institute never received Central Intelligence Agency money. But I did find that they had solicited lots of money and received substantial amounts of money from the National Endowment for Democracy and its subsidiaries, and had worked with lots of groups around the world who were funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. And everybody knows that history. You know, at its founding, it was founded during the Reagan administration, very soon after Reagan came into office. You know, its founders were clear that it would do a lot of what the CIA had previously been doing. And part of the reason that was necessary is because, you know, during the 60s, the CIA had its cover blown. It was funding, for example, the National Student Association. So it had to go under deeper cover. And we actually have leaked documents that say as much. Anyhow, all of that is in the piece. Returning to my reaction, so this is the interesting thing. I've been characterized as criticizing nonviolence. And actually, very much to the contrary, I support nonviolent struggle. What I object to is the way in which Gene Sharp has situated nonviolent struggle within authoritarian neoliberalism and the U.S. imperial project, which in my opinion is not a project that the American public is excited about or has consented to. That project has to be very vigorous ways obscured in order to allow it to happen. So my feeling is that Gene Sharp has actually removed the heart out of the nonviolent tradition. He's actually taken something that emerges out of workers' struggles, peasant struggles, poor people's struggles, and he renders it legible for empire as a kind, you know, wolf in sheep's clothing sort of tactic. And in that way, he eviscerates it of its long, substantive political history. What does it actually mean to be nonviolent? It means to care about the people. It means to care about solidarity. It means to advance a world that is fairer and materially better for the working class. That's the, you know, there's as much history of nonviolent struggle within the labor movement. Obviously, the strike, the withdrawal of labor, that is a nonviolent tactic, as there is in, for example, religious struggles, abolitionism and so forth. So, I think what we see when Sharp is so blasé about, there being bloodshed, right? That stands in marked contrast to, for example, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who loved the people, right? I mean, always at stake in the development of his strategy was, how do I protect the people? How do I advance their interests and also protect them? So, I find this very disturbing. And so, my project vis-a-vis Gene Sharp is in a way to, push the dialectic forward to arrive at a higher synthesis when it comes to quote unquote nonviolent action. And to part 3 will do this, hopefully out later this year, which will focus on Sharp versus King, because those were really the two visions of what nonviolence meant, both as a tactic and substantively. And it's very telling that while we have streets named after King, if you ask the average U.S. activist who the father of nonviolence is, who should they go to learn about nonviolence, they will tell you Gene Sharp. So something's very wrong there.
Yeah, that is shocking.
Yeah.
I had actually never considered that. Here you have the New York Times essentially crediting the shy intellectual Gene Sharp with the Arab Spring and what took place in Egypt. Shy U.S. intellectual created playbook used in a revolution. I don't think he was very shy, and we get that from your piece. He was not shy.
I get into that. He was.
For the world's despots, his ideas can be fatal. And it, from dictatorship to democracy is a 93-page guide to toppling autocrats, available in download in 24 languages. Now let's just talk about the concrete impact of Gene Sharp, because this article, which was back in 2011, very different era than now, claims that he was toppling despots. But you could actually argue that what happened in Egypt, and you saw the exchange between the RT correspondent Gayen Chikian and Sharp, where she's challenging him and saying, your ideas may actually be making things worse here, is that the military dictatorship retrenched itself. I mean, under Mubarak, you had the front-facing president and then the deep state that controlled 1/3 of the economy. Now you have a general from the army just wearing a suit who is even more repressive than Mubarak. And the deep state basically easily gamed the Muslim Brotherhood into this scenario. But it all began with Gene Sharp tactics, and his longtime partner, Peter Ackerman, who you write about, basically created the April 6th movement in Egypt as this civil society front that wouldn't challenge the issue of Israel and would keep the street violence going. The street protests, and I watched what was taking place in Egypt during the period of upheaval when the Muslim Brotherhood was in power to the extent it was at all. There was not nonviolence taking place. Every day there were different horrific acts of violence, and the NDP billionaires and millionaires who backed Mubarak were basically paying teams of rioters to go out in the street and keep the situation unstable. Gene Sharp's tactics influenced what took place in Nicaragua in 2018, where around 300 people were killed. Many of them were Sandinistas. A large part of the country was put under blockade, and people were tortured at these blockades. It was not nonviolent, but many of the key figures who are now under detention in Nicaragua, who incited that rebellion, whether in the media or working behind the scenes, have said they are disciples of Gene Sharp. He is our teacher. Felix Maradiaga said, Gene Sharp is my master, and he's now being detained for his role in that violence. Venezuela, Juan Guaido, Leopoldo Lopez, all of these figures, they were trained through Canvas, which is a group that was spun out of Gene Sharp's Albert Einstein Institute. So maybe you talk about the concrete effect of Gene Sharp and whether it's actually made the world a better place. I think we can concretely say Martin Luther King's tactics of nonviolence improved American society and helped expand democracy. There's very little debate about that. But what about Gene Sharp's concrete legacy?
Yeah. So indeed, yes, he founded the Albert Einstein Institution with Peter Ackerman, whom you describe, Michael Milken, junk bond king's right-hand man. And also, Ackerman, board member at the Cato Institute Project for Social Security Choice, very clearly someone with neoliberal politics, by which I mean a politics that seeks to expand choice for capital, but impose ever more onerous restraints and compulsions upon labor. So Ackerman and Sharp have a very interesting pattern. So they claim that they help anyone who's interested in learning about Sharp's methods of nonviolent action. But if you actually look where they work, based on press reports, based on AEI's own annual reports, again and again, it is attacking countries, attacking quote unquote regimes that are either attempting to defend remnants of socialism. Indeed, their first real quote unquote success was aiding in the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's a very interesting story, which is in the piece.
Yeah.
From there, though, they go on to assist in the collapse of a variety of, so-called authoritarian regimes that incidentally are, and to be clear, some of them, weren't terribly nice and were very repressive, but their real crime was not going along with NATO's agenda, for example, or attempting to, for example, resist IMF and World Bank structural adjustment. So this is the pattern, and you're hard pressed. I spent 2 years on this research and was not able to find an example of Sharp and Ackerman and their colleagues at the AEI, at the Albert Einstein Institution, helping a U.S. client state, for example, Saudi Arabia. It's a great dictatorship, perhaps, people might be interested in overthrowing, but I did not find any evidence that Sharp and Ackerman and company were hard at work trying to make that happen. And to your question, how have their ideas and how have their efforts actually changed the world? You can look at the record. You can see, according to, again, annual reports, where Albert Einstein Institution felt that it had been successful. What happens? Neoliberalization. So removal of capital controls, deregulation, privatization, etc. And those policies hurt labor. Those policies hurt workers. They expand choice and liberty for capital, for corporations. And of course, that's the reason, that's how neoliberals are able to cloak themselves in concepts like liberty and choice, is because they do want it for the powerful. They want it for capital. But if you aren't in the ruling class, they want you to shut up and do what they ask of you. And if you don't comply when they ask, they will find ways to force you up until you are at the barrel of a gun in chains.
Right. And given all that history, it's sort of disturbing, although I'm not really surprised by the nation, that Gene Sharp has been hailed by progressive institutions like the nation as a nonviolent warrior, given his role in deliberately targeting socialist countries around the world. This is just a gushing, absolutely laudatory, uncritical obituary of Gene Sharp here. And it mentions his Albert Einstein Institute, calling it a bare bones, privately funded operation that's been spreading the word about nonviolence for 3 decades. But the Albert Einstein Institution is not bare bones. And it has been, as you write, it has at least indirectly received support from the CIA. So, I mean, you mentioned that Gene Sharp is regarded as the guru of nonviolence by many on the activist left in the US. How did that take place? And why is there this uncritical portrayal of Gene Sharp? Honestly, like at Moderate Rebels, my podcast with Ben Norton, and at the Grayzone, we always encounter Gene Sharp as a very negative figure, but there is no writing, or so little writing outside of our anti-imperialist circles about the negative effect he's had, except until your pieces came along. Why is that?
Great question. There's a Sun Tzu Art of War quotation that I love, which is that if you know yourself and your enemy, you will prevail in 100 battles. If you understand yourself but not your enemy, for every battle you win, you will lose another one. And if you understand neither yourself nor your enemy, you will lose every battle. I'm paraphrasing based on the translation. But what I love about that is it underscores how vital it is to understand your enemy. So I'm a democratic socialist. I'm also a Christian. I believe we should love our enemies, but we have them. We have enemies, and they do not have our best interests at heart. And it's incumbent upon us, both out of self-interest and in the interest of our children, and in the interest of our communities, to defend ourselves and to advance our interests. So how do these enemies work? And I'm saying this, Max, because again, so I didn't find any evidence that even like there's a subsidiary mechanism by which the Albert Einstein Institution received money from the CIA. I think it's really important for the left to think about how intelligence operates in the modern era, because you know, and this is connected to why haven't we, you know, why has the conversation about Gene Sharp only now really started? And I think part of it is because we have to be extremely precise in these conversations, or else we open ourselves up to dismissal. And you know, the left is making big asks of people. We ask for a lot of courage, and so I think what this story illustrates is a lesson about how the ruling class has been advancing its agenda for the past 50 years. And there's a lot of, you know, it's not a simple mechanistic thing. You know, it's actually quite complicated. I urge people who are interested in this, you know, take some time. I'm sorry they're long, but, you know, read it and you know, be amazed at how quite shrewd these mechanisms of advancing capital's interests worldwide have been, and learn about your enemy. Right.
And so your series really picks up steam during the Reagan era and afterwards, when I would say the so-called ruling class became more sophisticated about what had previously been covert activity, and it became overt activity.
Yes.
I'll pull up this David Ignatius article from the Washington Post in a second, which is so revealing. It's one of my favorite pieces to show people, to explain how U.S. intelligence works around the world, in Eastern Europe and the global South, to impose its agenda. And basically, Ignatius he profiles several figures who he calls overt operators. Many of them operate in the vein of Gene Sharp, are disciples of his. One is a funder, George Soros. Others are figures associated with the National Endowment for Democracy, which you mentioned. And they all look very anodyne on the surface. It almost seems banal. And what they do is they, in the words of Alan Weinstein, who was a co-founder of the National Endowment for Democracy, we do what the CIA used to do covertly. We just do it in the open. So the NED comes in and funds all these civil society groups, they call them. They fund opposition movements. They do things the US would never tolerate from Russia or China inside the US. Mm-hmm. And they then create instability. Then, you know, where the instability takes the form of protests, color revolutions against the dictator. How can you not support that? And they use these tactics of nonviolence, which are, as Gene Sharp said, violent. The marginal violence theory was employed by Hong Kong's protesters, who were actually in some cases rioters, in order to provoke the police to escalate the violence so that the West's cameras would see. And then what do you want after that? It's what what all of these opposition movements want. They want U.S. intervention directly, which is extremely violent. And so one of the things that Gene Sharp did, and you can talk more about this, is he wrote this manual From Dictatorship to Democracy, or it was a video. I think Martin Sheen narrated it. Both. And it was basically brought in through these overt U.S. intelligence channels into countries like, well, Yugoslavia, Serbia, and that was like one of their first major success stories. The U.S. Institute for Peace was involved in distributing it. So talk about his tactics and how people in the left, they tend to associate, you can write a book about all the evil things the CIA did 50 years ago in Indonesia today and get mainstream reviews. But if you talk about any of this, you'll be dismissed as kind of a conspiracist.
Right. Yeah, it's true. So, his tactics and U.S. activists embrace of those tactics and beyond tactics, the strategy and the ideology in which they're tacitly embedded. So, per my comment about understanding your enemy, I encourage people to read Gene Sharp. He, in the way that you would read Clausewitz, which he's been compared to, or Sun Tzu, or any great military strategist. I encourage you to read him. But the mistake that activists make is that they don't read him in context. The mistake that U.S. activists have been making for decades is that they read him ahistorically. They read him out of context. And part of the reason that is even possible is because of the collapse of political education. We used to have on the left this sort of pitch to people that we may or may not win, but at least you're going to get a good education. And that was really rooted in a left that was grounded in the labor movement. So there was a shift beginning in late 60s, 70s, the rise of the foundation-funded, nonprofit-oriented, quote-unquote, left, which is really a staffed professional movement. It's a middle-class movement of, led by college-educated people. And whether
a lot of people from labor, a lot of people from the Trotskyist left.
Yes. So this has impacted sort of, it's impacted labor. This shift has impacted labor unions as well, for sure. And there's a fixation on, instead of political education, training, which is, I think, a suspect word to really use when we're talking about mobilizing, for example, the working class. We are trying to principally begin with education. And I think part of the reason this shift has happened is because this new formation, this sort of new left, was accountable fundamentally, when you look at their budgets, to institutions of higher education and foundations. And those institutions have boards of directors, and the members of those boards also sit on the boards of major U.S. banks and major U.S. corporations. And so we just need a more frank conversation about what it means to have so many organs of the so-called left structurally dependent on the class that is exploiting global labor.
That is a great point. That's an excellent point. And I did receive a comment just now. Have Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, or any other leaders targeted by these tactics actually spoken about Gene Sharp? And yes, I'm struggling to find it right now because of YouTube's algorithm, but Hugo Chavez actually delivered an entire speech or lecture on his program Allo Presidente, where he spoke for an hour about Gene Sharp and read from his book From Dictatorship to Democracy, and said many of the things that Marcie's saying right now, which is that the agenda really is neoliberalism. The agenda is to impose corporate control. It is not democracy.
Hey everyone, this is Ben again. I'm going to translate this clip of Hugo Chavez talking about Gene Sharp. And this is because, of course, people who are listening and not just watching can't read subtitles. So I'm going to translate the audio. Here we go.
El imperialismo norteamericano.
North American imperialism is basing itself on this thesis. Here I'm going to show it. This was given to me by a tactical command student in Miraflores. And it has a note on here saying, notice, warning, this is the imperial plan. This is the thesis of Gene Sharp, who I've referenced before. It's called From Dictatorship to Democracy, a Conceptual System for Liberation. This is the handbook for the soft coup. Soft coup. This is why the U.S. government, this is why the Venezuelan oligarchy is so dedicated to trying to convince the people, to the world above all, that here there's a dictatorship. They have created a fantasy dictatorship to later justify the soft coup against the so-called dictatorship. I'm studying it because we are in the counteroffensive. And Venezuelan students, at least the great majority, have discovered how they have tried to use the sacred name of students, the condition of students. The students and the youth have always been in favor of the causes of the people and not against the people. But there are some students, and I'm going to say it because it's true, there are some students who are manipulated. And the students who are being manipulated, they are trying to use them as cannon fodder to create chain effects that leads to the overthrow of the government.
I also went to a major opposition protest in Venezuela in support of Juan Guaido and spoke to some of the people there who were doing the training that you talk about.
Yeah.
And I said, what kind of training are you doing? And they're like, we're getting into the barrios, the slums, and we're telling people that they don't need the clap box, which was basically a box of free food and sanitary supplies. And we don't need the government. And we're training them in, independence, political independence. And I said, what do you think of the theories of Gene Sharp? And they said, we love Gene Sharp. He is our guru. I mean, so the trainers actually first received training from the international trainers who bring the Gene Sharp ideas in. Mm-hmm. And then they go and train, parts of the population that are vulnerable that the US wants to, or other interests want to mobilize against the government.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's exactly right.
Now you mentioned, the left actually kind of that these institutions have altered the left. I mean, we've come under attack at the Grayzone by outlets that present themselves as progressive that are literally sponsored by the National Endowment for Democracy. Whether it's Bellingcat or Coda Story, they are actually directly sponsored by these intelligence cutouts. But when you talk about, kind of a corporatization of the left or a liberalization of the U.S. left, what institutions are you referring to specifically? What media outlets and what effect has this had in left-wing organizing that you've seen?
Well, I will say this: you will know them by their fruits.
You don't want to name names.
I think classic examples. Some of the shrewdest foundations. Philanthropic foundations in U.S. history. I mean, I'm not breaking news here. People have written many books about this.
Right. The Ford Foundation.
So the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundations.
Rockefeller Foundation is now run by Rajiv Shah, who is the former administrator of USAID, which is essentially U.S. intelligence cutout. Mm-hmm. He helped design the Zunzuneo platform in Cuba, which was attempting to kind of create flash mobs and instability inside Cuba. Mm-hmm. So you do see these foundations sponsoring progressive journals and progressive institutions. It's true. The Rockefeller Brothers Foundation as well, which is separate from the Rockefeller Foundation.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, before we shift topics, I mean, how do you think the left in the US can resist this program? And actually begin to form, its own independent institutions when there's so much, in academia, in progressive media, there's so much pressure to get the grant money, and everything's been so NGOified. I wrote about all these advocates of the Green New Deal going out to this resort, whether it's Van Jones or Naomi Klein or Alicia Garza, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, and they go there for training, and then they meet funders there who are offering them lots of money. But these are funders from essentially the billionaire class. And these are people coming there who are like left-wing street organizers who have radical backgrounds. It's a very disturbing dynamic. How do you stay out of that if you're in the left or you're in academia?
That's a great question. So I do not like the idea, which is peddled by some, that the important revolution is the inner one, because I think that obscures what world historically revolution has actually meant. And it's not being straight with people. But I do think that there are some inner adjustments that those of us who constitute the self-identified left have to make. And one of them, for example, is getting beyond the idea that our value, our identity flows from our waged work, that we aren't an organizer, we aren't a political educator unless we are getting paid to do those things. I think all of us have skills that we should develop and figure out how to support ourselves doing that. And relatedly, for those of us on the self-identified left, we need to we need to ensure that, and I don't want to pretend like it's easy, that we have clarity on the programs we are proposing. Because one of the things that Gene Sharp, for example, makes it very easy to do is simply have a politics of opposition. And that stunts political movements. It stunts us in a very adolescent place. Screw you, dad, anarchism is sometimes what I used to describe. Yeah. We have got to move beyond simply opposing. And we have got to get down and dirty in the details of what we are proposing. And that requires knowing something about history substantively. That requires wrangling with the challenging moral contradictions of power. I don't want to suggest that this is super easy to do, but on the other hand, I don't think it's all that hard to do either. And I think we should all take comfort and courage in the fact that little adjustments can have big ramifications. Little ideological adjustments can have big ramifications. And we're in a very chaotic moment world historically right now, and a lot is up for grabs. And so I think we have to sort of, take a step of faith. We have to make sure that we are clear about what we are about. That incidentally, that requires engaging criticism. That requires, kicking the tires on our own ideas and letting other people do that to us. So we got to toughen up a little bit. But I think if we do some of the things I just listed, we'll be much better off.
Well, and I would argue, just acknowledging that imperialism exists is an important thing the left in the U.S. often fails to do, and you see in a lot of democratic socialist circles or what anarchist circles.
Yeah,
protests are just seen as organic, even if the U.S. is directly involved, sponsoring the leadership, and the government is an anti-imperialist government or a socialist government or simply just independent from the U.S. sphere of influence, as Syria was. Acknowledging imperialism casts all of these so-called protest movements, which often turn into violent, dirty wars, in a totally different light. We're looking at what's happening in Nicaragua, where opposition figures are being jailed and put on trial, acknowledging that they have been nurturing relationships with the U.S. intelligence, raking in money from USAID, and sponsoring destabilization activities for at least a decade. Acknowledging that on the left is a duty, I think, and that's one of the things we try to do at the Grayzone, is just to provide that context that's always left out, as it was from that Nation Gene Sharp ode to Gene Sharp.
So we're going to end the segment there. You were listening to Max's new show over at Rockfin, that is ROKFIN, and his new show is called Foreign Agents. I have a new show over there as well called Propaganda Today. And you can follow these, you can check out the second half of his stream with Marcie Smith Parenti. Again, unfortunately, we weren't allowed to post it anywhere else because of the incredible censorship regime that we're living under right now. These big tech corporations will instantly remove something and potentially put a strike on your channel on YouTube if you even talk about some of these issues. But if you want to listen to his discussion surrounding COVID-19 and vaccination and some other issues that we can't talk about, you can go over to rockfin.com. And this will also, we're going to post some of this exclusive content over at our Patreon. So if you want to support the show Moderate Rebels and get access to some of that exclusive content, not only from Moderate Rebels, but also be cross-posting some of the content from Rockfin, you can go to patreon.com/Moderate Rebels. Unfortunately, censorship has become so bad that we're having to diversify our platforms. We'd like to make a lot of this stuff all publicly available, but it's just impossible these days with growing censorship. So thanks for checking out this show, Moderate Rebels, and you should go check out Max's show, Foreign Agents, and my show, Propaganda Today. It's all under the big umbrella of the Grayzone. So thanks for listening to us. Thanks for supporting us, and we'll see you next time.